At 5:17 local time in the North Atlantic, the sea is calm, visibility is good, and flight operations are in progress. Inside the Combat Information Center, the Spy 1 radar marks 5 new surface contacts at the far edge of the display. Multiple tracks bearing 041, range 22 nautical miles, speed 24 knots, and closing. No one shows any reaction, but across CIC, every console instantly shifts focus. 5 ships do not appear out of nowhere in a tight formation at high speed. The identification system sends out its query. No reply. IFF comes back empty. At 5:18, the formation pulls in even tighter. The 5 vessels settle into a shallow wedge, their bows angled straight toward the projected path of the carrier strike group. Their speed increases, contacts now making 28 knots. That is not a routine patrol pace, that is a deliberate approach. On the carrier's bridge, the officer of the deck receives the update. Course and speed stay exactly the same. 25 knots, steady heading. In a close approach, the first rule is simple. Do not be the first to flinch. At 5:19, electronic support measures begin picking up emissions. Low-power surface search radar sweeps are detected from at least 2 of the incoming ships. A few seconds later, a stronger signal appears, narrow beam, higher gain. Possible targeting quality scan, the electronic warfare officer reports. Still no radio contact. The 5 ships are now within 20 nautical miles. Ahead of the formation, 2 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers from the strike group increase speed and adjust bearing, sliding outward to widen the defensive screen. A Ticonderoga-class cruiser shifts to port, extending radar coverage and creating overlapping sectors of response. No alarms sound, and no general call is made. But Condition 3 is quietly set. Key stations are manned. The vertical launch system is powered and ready. Safeties remain in place. At 5:21, identification data starts to sharpen through hull profiles and emissions analysis. Probable Russian Federation naval combatants, frigate-class signatures, 1 larger hull, likely a destroyer. Range drops to 15 nautical miles. On the flight deck, 2 FA-18 Super Hornets are moved into catapult position. Their loadouts are defensive. AIM-12, OAMR, AAMs, and AIM-9, X-Sidewinders. No strike package. Pure air cover configuration. The order comes down calmly from primary flight control. Launch. Steam bursts from Catapult 2. The first Hornet is in the air within seconds, banking hard and climbing through 5,000 feet. The second follows less than half a minute later. Neither aircraft switches on active radar. Both stay passive, listening, watching, recording. At 5:23, the Russian formation accelerates again. Contacts now at 30 knots. Full speed. Their wakes carve long white lines across the dark Atlantic. Then the geometry begins to change. Instead of holding a straight intercept, the outermost ships begin easing outward. 1 to port, 1 to starboard, stretching the formation into a shallow arc. This is not random drift, it is a shaping maneuver. Closest point of approach is recalculated. CPA now 2.88 nautical miles and still shrinking. At that distance, a small steering mistake can become a collision. A deliberate turn can be read as hostile intent. Inside CIC, the Aegis combat system tracks each ship with exact solution data. Response envelopes are calculated in silence. Intercept timelines populate the screens in green digital numbers. Nothing is launched, but every option is prepared. At 5:25, one of the Russian ships emits another brief spike, stronger than before. 3 seconds, then gone. The electronic warfare officer looks up. That one was closer. No one says more. On the bridge, the captain studies the tactical display without raising his voice. Maintain course, maintain speed, log everything. The carrier does not alter heading. The message is unmistakable. This transit is lawful, deliberate, and not open to intimidation. The 2 Super Hornets level off at 20,000 feet, orbiting above the widening arc of steel below. Their sensor pods zoom in, capturing hull numbers, deck crews, and gun positions. Infrared imagery confirms heat signatures from forward stations on at least 2 ships. Not fully active, but not neutral either. At 5:27, the range drops below 9 nautical miles. The Russian formation now stretches nearly 4 miles across the horizon. The central destroyer holds the most aggressive line, bow aimed directly at the carrier's projected path. Wake turbulence builds. Speed remains at 30 knots. At 5:28, the Condition 3 posture tightens again. Failing CIWS, mounts shift from passive standby to track-ready mode. The 5-inch guns remain trained fore and aft, but their alignment is adjusted just enough to be noticed through long-range optics, enough to send a message without a word. The Aegis system updates its projections. CPA now 1.9 nautical miles. This is no longer routine proximity. That is pressure. No radio hail comes from the Russian formation, no warning follows, just 5 warships closing fast, tightening the geometry around an American aircraft carrier in international waters. At 5:29, every screen inside CIC is filled with converging lines. Every officer understands how small the margin has become. One sustained radar track, one abrupt helm change, one misread move, and the quiet North Atlantic morning could split apart in seconds. The range keeps falling, 6 nautical miles, 5. The formation continues to close and no one gives way. At 5:31 local time, the range reaches 5 nautical miles. Then the pattern changes. The 5 Russian warships no longer hold a straight intercept line. Instead, the formation starts to open up. 2 ships ease gradually to port, 2 to starboard, while the central destroyer keeps driving straight toward the carrier's bow. The move is subtle, deliberate, and impossible to miss. Inside the Combat Information Center, bearing lines stretch across the tactical display like wires being pulled tight. "They're spreading," a surface tracking officer notes. The Aegis system runs the numbers again. Closest point of approach drops once more. CPA, now 1.4 nautical miles. At this distance, there is no room for mistakes. A commercial ship would alter course. A smaller warship might slow down. The carrier does neither. 25 knots. Steady heading. The strike group tightens in response. The forward destroyer slides half a mile closer to the carrier's projected track, forming a visible shield. The cruiser adjusts 2 degrees to starboard, widening radar overlap and making sure no gaps appear between the ships. No sirens, no combat alarm, just quiet movement and exact corrections. At 5:32, the first Russian ship on the starboard flank adds speed again. Contact now making 32 knots. Full speed. Whitewater tears from its stern as it drives harder into the turn, cutting diagonally toward the carrier's projected path. This is no longer shadowing, this is a pressure maneuver. Bridge-to-bridge radio is opened. Russian naval vessels operating bearing 041. This is a United States warship conducting lawful transit in international waters. Your current maneuvers are unsafe. Recommend alter course immediately. Silence. The central Russian destroyer holds steady, its bow cutting forward at high speed. Through long-range optics, deck crews can be seen clearly. Helmets on. Personnel positioned near forward stations. Nothing is aimed, but nothing looks relaxed. At 5:33, electronic support measures spike again. A narrow beam radar emission sweeps across the carrier's signature. Longer this time. 5 seconds, then gone. Possible targeting quality scan. The electronic warfare officer confirms inside CIC. No one raises their voice, but Aegis immediately shifts priority. Response solutions finalize in the background. SM2 timelines show ready. Phalanx systems begin auto-tracking each hull. Above them, the Super Hornets descend. Altitude now 12,000 feet. Still passive, still silent, just closer. Their sensor pods zoom tight on bridge windows and mast arrays, recording everything in sharp detail. Hull numbers, deck posture, radar rotations. At 5:34, the Russian ship on the port flank mirrors the starboard maneuver, adding speed and sliding outward to widen the arc. Now the geometry is unmistakable. The carrier is sitting at the center of a forming semicircle. Range 3 nautical miles, CPA 1.1. If the starboard Russian ship holds its current line, it will cross less than a mile ahead of the carrier's bow. At 25 knots, that leaves only seconds to react. On the bridge, the captain studies the surface plot. Maintain course. No hesitation. If the carrier turns first, the story changes. At 5:35, the starboard Russian destroyer commits. Its bow cuts across the carrier's projected path. Wake surges hard against the hull as it holds 32 knots. Inside CIC, the bearing lines snap tighter. CPA now 0.9 nautical miles, less than a mile. At that distance, collision avoidance margins become razor thin. One sudden rudder input from either side could bring steel into contact. Overhead, one Super Hornet drops lower, down to 5,000 feet, placing itself directly between the starboard Russian ship and the carrier's bow line. Not aggressive. No active radar. Just present. A message written in steel and jet noise. Below, the carrier never changes heading. The central Russian destroyer stays pointed straight in, keeping the pressure on. For the next 30 seconds, the geometry tightens even more. Another radar spike flashes, stronger than before. Inside CIC, a targeting alert flickers. Not a full lock, but close. Vertical launch cells remain ready. Safety's still on. The phalanx mounts rotate by fractions, tracking arcs lining up with the approaching hulls. No shots. Not yet. At 5:37, the tension reaches its peak. 5 Russian warships, 1 American carrier, less than a mile separating steel, speed, and intent. The starboard Russian vessel continues its crossing move. The carrier's bow closes fast, 25 knots, 32 knots. More than 50 knots of combined closure speed feeding across the CIC displays. Every response timer is live. One bad command, one misread radar return, and the Atlantic could erupt in seconds. Then the central Russian destroyer begins to ease back. 30 knots, 25, 22. The reduction is slight, but decisive. The starboard ship softens its crossing angle. The portside vessels drift outward by a few degrees. The semicircle starts to loosen. Radar emissions drop in strength. The narrow beam scan disappears completely. The range begins to open again. 1.2 nautical miles, 1.5, then 2. Inside CIC, no one celebrates, but everyone sees it. They are backing off. The carrier never changed course, never reduced speed, never flinched. At 5:39, the 5 Russian ships slide into a parallel shadowing formation. Still close, still visible, but no longer closing in from multiple angles. The geometry has changed. The flashpoint has passed. For now. By 5:41 local time, the range is 2 nautical miles and widening. The semicircle is gone, but the formation has not broken apart. The 5 Russian warships now run nearly parallel to the carrier strike group, offset to port and starboard, holding position just outside immediate collision range. Shadowing, close, intentional, calculated. Inside the Combat Information Center, no one relaxes. Aegis continues tracking all 5 hulls, with engagement solutions still active in the background. Response envelopes remain valid. Target priority updates every second. The danger has not ended. It has only changed shape. At 5:42, electronic support measures pick up a fresh emission. Stronger, tighter, a targeting grade radar spike. 6 seconds in duration, longer than before. Long enough to confirm deliberate intent. On the tactical display, a thin red arc flashes briefly over the track of the central Russian destroyer. It is not a launch, not yet. But it is a test of the boundary. The captain's voice stays calm. Confirm source. Central contact bearing 040. Above, the Super Hornets shift slightly, holding 8,000 feet while tightening lateral spacing to keep visual control. Their sensors continue recording. No active radar, no tone, just silent pressure overhead. At 5:43, one of the Russian frigates on the port side makes a subtle correction. 3 degrees inward. CPA drops again. 1.3 nautical miles. Not as tight as before, but clearly intentional. The geometry starts tightening once more. On the carrier's forward deck, the 5-inch mount adjusts by a fraction. The movement is mechanical, deliberate, visible through long-range optics. Not aimed directly, but aligned enough to make the message clear. Failing systems remain in tracking posture. Their white domes pivot slightly as each Russian hull passes through engagement arcs. Inside CIC, the tension compresses into silence. Every operator understands the margin. If that radar spike holds, if it shifts from search to firm track, the response window shrinks to seconds. At 5:44, the central Russian destroyer increases speed again, from 22 knots to 28. Its wake brightens, tearing across the cold Atlantic. The parallel formation begins drifting closer once more. This is the moment, the pressure point. Combined closure rates again push past 50 knots of relative movement between arcs and vectors. The lead Super Hornet drops lower, now at 4,000 feet, crossing directly over the projected line of the central Russian ship. Still passive, still silent. Its shadow cuts across the Russian deck. Infrared shows movement below. No systems elevated, but every face is turned upward. At 5:45, the radar spike returns. 8 seconds this time, long enough to register as a sustained targeting sweep. Inside CIC, a targeting alert pulses softly. Aegis immediately refines its solution. SM-2 intercept timelines appear in green numerals. Time to intercept calculations fall below 30 seconds if needed. Vertical launch cells remain ready. Safety still engaged. The captain gives no order. He waits. The line between provocation and escalation is razor thin. At 5:46, the Russian frigate on the port side accelerates, edging closer toward the cruiser screening the carrier. The cruiser answers with a 2-degree outward adjustment, maintaining separation without giving ground. Neither side turns away. Neither side acts first. For 15 seconds, the Atlantic seems to hold its breath. Radar emissions from the central Russian destroyer remain steady at elevated power. Every operator in CIC knows exactly what that means. This is not an accidental sweep. This is a test of nerve. The Super Hornet wingman tightens its orbit, visible from every Russian deck. 2 American fighters overhead, 5 Russian hulls below, steel above steel. Then at 5:47, something changes. The radar spike flickers, weakens, vanishes. The central Russian destroyer reduces speed again, 28 knots down to 23. Its bow shifts 1 degree outward, small but measurable. The portside frigate eases off its inward drift. The geometry begins to open. CPA rises again, 1.8 nautical miles, then 2.2. The cruiser holds course. The carrier never breaks course. At 5:48, the Russian formation settles into a clean parallel line, offset to port and starboard, but no longer tightening inward. Radar activity drops back to low-power surface search. No targeting grade scans, no sustained tracking. The flashpoint passes without crossing over. Inside CIC, the silence finally breaks. They backed off. There is no cheering, no visible relief, only recognition. Every second of the last 6 minutes has been captured. Radar signatures, maneuver geometry, emission strength, deck posture. The intelligence value is high. Escalation was avoided. By 5:49, the range opens beyond 3 nautical miles. The 5 Russian warships remain in sight, running parallel at moderate speed, close enough to make their presence clear, far enough to remove immediate collision risk. The Super Hornets climb again to 12,000 feet, holding overwatch. The carrier strike group continues its lawful transit at 25 knots, unchanged. The Atlantic grows quiet again, but no one inside CIC mistakes what just happened. For nearly 6 minutes, the line between shadowing and open confrontation was measured in seconds and signal strength. One sustained radar track, one early launch decision, one sharp overcorrection at the helm, and the North Atlantic might have seen chaos instead of restraint. Instead, both sides held, barely, and in that razor-thin space between escalation and control, everything shifted. At 5:50 local time, the range is 3.5 nautical miles and still widening. The 5 Russian warships maintain their new parallel formation, offset wide on both flanks of the carrier strike group. They are no longer compressing inward, no longer shaping for encirclement, but they are still close. Close enough for hull numbers to remain visible through long-range optics. Close enough for the wake from their bows to carve sharp white lines across the Atlantic. Inside the Combat Information Center, the tempo does not ease. Aegis continues full-spectrum tracking. Every Russian hull remains inside engagement parameters. Response solutions stay updated and current. Vertical launch systems remain powered. Phalanx mounts stay aligned. The drop in pressure is noted, but not yet trusted. At 5:51, electronic support measures confirm the shift. Russian emissions have returned to a surface search profile. No targeting quality signals are detected. That is the first clear sign of de-escalation. The central Russian destroyer, which had held the most aggressive line, reduces speed again, from 23 knots to 19. Its bow shifts another 2 degrees outward. The geometry opens cleanly. CPA now projects at more than 4 nautical miles. That is no longer collision territory. That is shadow distance. On the carrier's bridge, the captain studies the tactical display in silence. No course correction, no speed change. Maintain transit. The message remains consistent. The carrier will not alter lawful navigation. At 5:52, one of the Russian frigates drops farther aft, slipping behind the line of the central destroyer. The flanking ships widen their lateral spacing, no longer trying to bracket the carrier from both sides. The semicircle is gone. What remains is a loose parallel escort. Intent still visible, pressure reduced. Above, the Super Hornets climb back to 15,000 feet, widening their orbit while keeping sensors fixed on the Russian formation. Their presence is still obvious from every deck below. Infrared pods continue recording. Optical zoom confirms forward stations are unmanned. No launch hatches open. No gun mounts are trained. At 5:53, bridge-to-bridge radio finally crackles to life. A Russian accented voice comes through, calm and formal. United States Naval Formation. This is Russian Federation Navy vessel, conducting routine maritime operations in international waters. It is not an apology. It is not a concession. But it is communication. The response from the cruiser is just as controlled. Russian naval vessels, United States formation, conducting lawful transit. Unsafe maneuvers have been recorded. Recommend continued safe separation. There is no further exchange. No rise in tone. Just 2 major powers acknowledging each other over open water. Inside CIC, analysts mark the timestamp. First Russian radio transmission, 5:53. 36 minutes passed from initial radar contact to formal communication. That detail will matter later. By 5:54, the range extends beyond 5 nautical miles. The Russian formation now matches speed at roughly 18 knots, trailing slightly astern of the carrier's starboard quarter. Shadowing, not pressing. The most dangerous window has closed, but its imprint remains. At 5:55, Condition 3 stays in effect, though internal readiness begins to normalize. Safety protocols remain in place. Engagement timelines are still valid, but no longer flashing as high-priority alerts. Phalanx mounts return to broader search arcs. Electronic warfare consoles continue passive monitoring. Every signal coming off the Russian ships continues to be logged. Frequency patterns, power levels, modulation characteristics. The intelligence value remains significant. On the flight deck, additional aircraft are positioned but not launched. The air wing stays at Ready 5 status, prepared but not pushing the situation further. At 5:57, the central Russian destroyer makes a slight course change to the north, 5 degrees away from the carrier's track. The flanking ships follow gradually. The move is subtle but decisive. Separation is restored. 6 nautical miles, then 7. Inside CIC, the geometry finally settles into something stable. The senior tactical officer lets out a slow breath. Not relief, but recalibration. No shots, no collision, no launch hatches opened, but the gap between routine shadowing and a serious naval standoff had narrowed to only seconds. The carrier never turned, never slowed, never gave up control of its navigation, and that is the detail that matters most. By 6 o'clock, the Russian formation has settled into a more distant parallel track, no longer converging. The Atlantic looks calm again. Sunlight flashes across steel hulls, moving through separate arcs of intent. Above, the Super Hornets widen their orbit and begin working back toward fuel check thresholds. The strike group resumes a more standard transit posture, though every console remains fully alert. Because encounters like this do not end when the ships pull apart. They continue in analysis rooms, intelligence briefs, and strategic assessments. For 33 minutes, 5 Russian warships tried to compress the space around a U.S. aircraft carrier. For 33 minutes, that space held. No retreat, no escalation. Just measured steel and disciplined restraint. The break was not dramatic. It came in increments. A few degrees of rudder, a few knots of speed, 1 radar emission lowered. But at sea, those small changes mean everything. And as the range stretches toward 8 nautical miles, one fact remains clear. The pressure was applied, the boundary held, and neither side crossed the final line. By 6:05 local time, the range has opened to 9 nautical miles. The 5 Russian warships remain visible on the horizon, their silhouettes smaller now, moving in a loose shadow pattern off the carrier strike group's starboard quarter. No longer compressing, no longer shaping for encirclement, just present. The Atlantic looks calm again, but inside the Combat Information Center, nothing about the last 48 minutes feels routine. Every radar spike, every course change, every variation in speed, all of it is being replayed in real time. At 6:06, the Super Hornets begin cycling back toward the carrier. Fuel states are checked, sensors still recording. Their mission was deterrence, not engagement. They never switched to active radar. They never moved beyond a defensive posture. But their presence changed the geometry, and that point is entered into the record. Inside CIC, the tactical action officer reviews the timeline. 5:17, initial radar contact. 5:23, acceleration to flank speed. 5:34, semi-encirclement formation. 5:42, sustained fire control radar spike. 5:47, speed reduction and outward turn. The turning point is unmistakable. It came the moment that radar spike held beyond 5 seconds. That was the threshold. If it had continued, if it had developed into a full lock, decision time would have collapsed. Vertical launch systems were ready. SM-2 intercept windows had already been calculated. Phalanx systems were aligned. The response would not have been dramatic. It would have been immediate. By 6:08, electronic emissions from the Russian formation fall back to a baseline patrol profile. No targeting scans, no elevated power. Their formation slowly drifts north, opening the distance to 12 nautical miles. Shadowing turns into separation. The Atlantic settles back into silence, but something important has changed. On the bridge, the captain steps away from the tactical display. The carrier never changed course, never slowed down, never gave up control of its own navigation. That matters. Naval power is not measured only in hardware or tonnage. It is measured by who holds position and control when the pressure is at its highest. At 6:10, flight operations resume at full tempo. Another aircraft launches, routine cycle. Steam rises, engines thunder, and from the outside it looks as though nothing happened at all. But inside CIC, the data transfer is already underway. Emission libraries are updated, frequency signatures logged, targeting radar patterns captured in full detail. In just 48 minutes, the Russian ships revealed more than they likely intended. And that is where the real shift begins. This was not only a test of distance, it was a test of reaction time, of discipline, of whether a U.S. carrier would give way under pressure. It did not. By 6:12, the range passes 15 nautical miles. The 5 Russian hulls are now distant shapes along the horizon. No longer closing, no longer maneuvering for position, simply fading into the background. There will be no immediate press release, no dramatic footage will appear within the hour, but both navies will write their reports. Both will study the maneuver geometry frame by frame. And both will understand just how narrow the margin really was. For nearly 6 minutes, conditions hovered just below the threshold. One sustained targeting signal, one misunderstood maneuver, one premature decision, and the North Atlantic might have seen far more than wake lines and radio traffic. Instead, it witnessed discipline. The carrier strike group continues its transit at 25 knots, unchanged, unshaken, and moving on its own terms. The Russian formation gradually turns north and away, increasing the gap to 20 nautical miles. By 6:15, the shadowing phase is over. Condition 3 is eased internally, quietly. Systems return to standard readiness. Safeties remain in place. Watch rotations begin returning to a more normal rhythm, but no one mistakes what just happened. The boundary was tested, the geometry was compressed, the margin narrowed to seconds. And inside that narrow space, something changed. Both sides now leave with fresh data, fresh insight, and fresh evidence of how the other responds under pressure. The Atlantic remains calm, but the next encounter will not begin from zero. It will begin with memory. And at sea, memory can shape the next move as strongly as any show of force. Because when 5 warships close on a carrier, and the carrier does not flinch, the message lasts long after the ships turn away.